Good morning, everyone. My name is Denvil Duncan. I am a graduate of the Department of Economics here at the University of the West Indies. And today I'm going to present this paper that is co-authored with Philipp Doerrenberg and Danyang, looking at race and gender in employee decision-making. So I'll just kind of briefly motivate what we're doing and then give you an idea of the data generation process as well as the results. So the motivation for the study is basically tied to the growth in the online market space. So we see crowdsourcing platforms that have kind of grown tremendously in the last couple of years. And here I have some examples that I won't go through, but just you could see in, across various dimensions of crowdsourcing that there has been a lot of growth, and it's playing an important role in the economy. Now, the growth in the platforms have obviously kind of helped to make life easier for a lot of people, but then we see that there is a growing body of literature showing that it's not necessarily equal across all types of people. And so you can see studies looking at home rental, use of taxi services, classified ad markets, such as Craigslist, or even goods market trying to buy products on eBay, all show evidence that there is discriminatory treatment across particularly race, but also gender. What is somewhat missing, at least based on the search that we've done, is that we don't seem to see the same set of literature kind of growing on labor markets. So there's a lot of evidence on discrimination in labor markets that you would consider real labor markets or traditional labor markets, but not a whole lot in the online space. And it turns out that the online labor market space is also pretty big and growing. You can see MTurk, that I'll talk about in a minute, is a big player in this kind of online labor marketplace. So what we're going to do in this project, or at least what we're working on, is a project where we try to determine the extent to which the same type of discriminatory practices exist in online labor markets. And for this particular paper, we're looking at a case where we send signals of race and gender to employees and then determine whether or not they're using this information to make their employment decisions. And in this particular study, we're looking at the exit decision, and you'll see why we frame it as job exit rather than job selection. Now, the work that we're doing is slightly different from some of the existing work. So generally, they tend to focus on discrimination by the employer against the employees. We're kind of looking at the reverse of that. We're checking to see whether or not employees discriminate against employers. We're looking at the online crowdsourcing labor market. The existing literature tends to focus on the traditional labor market. I'm going to make the claim that we're able to measure the salience or the intensity of the treatment, which then allows us to determine if intensity of treatment affects the decision of these employees. And then we kind of have a follow-up survey where we're looking at motivations. Today I'll not talk about the motivation piece, kind of just presenting the first part of the experiment. So quick overview. So first I'll just talk a little bit about what is MTurk. Let's say a large online crowdsourcing labor market that is run by Amazon. What happens on this labor market is if I have a task that I'd like to get some help with, I basically post what is called a human intelligence task, hits. This thing goes on MTurk. Workers on MTurk can see this hit and then make a decision as to whether or not they want to accept the hit. And if they accept, they'll then complete for pay. And so the hit will specify things like, what it is that I want to be done, how long it should take the employees to complete this particular task, and how they will be paid. And payment can either be in the form of a piece rate, or would you consider a wage rate, or a bonus. And then from the worker's point of view, they can see this hit depending on their qualifications for that hit. So you can specify that this hit is only available for people who work in the US or live in the US. And so anyone without a US IP address would not be able to see this particular task. So as long as they qualify for the hit, they'll see the requester's name, they'll get a description of the hit, they'll get a description of the compensation package. So then a question you might ask is, can people discriminate on MTurk? And the answer is, well, maybe yes, maybe no. On the maybe yes side of it, we have a lot of tasks. And so if I come upon an employer that I'm not interested in working for, I can quickly switch to someone else. So there's the opportunity to quickly switch from task to task. And if I'm someone who is willing to discriminate against people, I can find an alternative to the task that is currently posted. The other thing to note is, kind of on the maybe not side, is that MTurk is largely anonymous. I can see the name of the requester or the employer, but I don't necessarily have to interact with that person. All I see is the hit, I complete the hit, I get my payment, I never have to interact with this person. And so you might say, well, then there's no need for me to discriminate against these employers. And so what we found in the follow-up survey is that people actually do state, self-report, that they use this kind of name information that they have when they make their decision. So again, I won't present that, but that kind of supports the idea that discrimination might be possible on MTurk. So then the question is, how do we signal the race and gender of the employer in kind of the setting? And so what we've found in the literature is that there are kind of two strategies. One, you specify the name of the person. And so most of the existing literature on discrimination in labor markets, they'll send out these CVs. They randomize the type of names that you see. Some names are traditionally black, some names are traditionally white. And then you check to see if there's any difference in callback rates or wages that are offered. So that's kind of one thing that has been done. It's been done in the labor market, in the housing market, in the online car markets. Another strategy that has been used is to actually show a picture of the person. And so there's this really nice study that was done in Israel where they sent out CVs, and on the CV is a picture, a headshot of the person who is looking the job. And it turns out that this is very common in Israel to send out your CVs with a picture of yourself, and so they use this to vary the characteristics of the employee. Then there's another study that was done in the US looking at this market website called Craigslist, where they post an iPod and they show the hand of the person holding the iPod. So you can see the skin of the person and determine if the race of this individual. And so that's the strategy that we're going to use. And so we'll post a hit on MTurk, and you'll see in a minute what it looks like, but you get to see the hand of the person, and from the hand, you can then determine if this person is black or white, or if this person is male or female, and then we use that as our treatment variable. So again, I apologize quickly for this slide. You can't really see what's going on, but it represents a flow description of the experiment. So we post a hit on MTurk, that's the first part up here, and in that hit we say, hey, we have the survey that we'd like you to complete. If you accept, follow this particular link. They click on that link and it takes them to Qualtrics, which is just a software tool you can use to administer surveys. And then once they're in Qualtrics, they're then randomly assigned to one of 5 groups. And in those groups, we vary race and gender. And then once they have been assigned, they then get treatment information. They make a decision, and the decision they make at this point is one of our primary outcome variables. And if they decide, yes, they want to work, then they will transcribe some information. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And that then becomes our second outcome variable, which is an intensity variable. If they say no, they exit. If they say yes, once they've completed their transcription, they then complete a post-survey questionnaire. And in that post-survey questionnaire, we collect some salient stuff that I'll talk about in a minute. So this is what the treatment information looks like. It just says, hey, thank you for completing my survey. I have this additional task that I would like you to complete. It provides a description of that task, including what needs to be transcribed, how long it should take them to transcribe these receipts, and how much they will be paid for each receipt that they transcribe. So they get all of the information in this description. They also see at the same time a picture. So they see, hey, here is a receipt. I would like you to transcribe the information from this receipt, but you can see there it's varying the skin color of the hand, as well as we can introduce some nail polish. The picture they see in the experiment is a lot better than the one you see here. So I had to kind of reduce the size of the picture so it could fit on the slide. So it's this large picture that clearly shows the hand, the skin color, whether or not there's a nail polish, the receipt that they have to transcribe, and so on. But just to give you a flavor of what it looks like. Then they get this question, would you like to transcribe or would you like to work for me in this particular task? And they have to hit yes or no. If they hit yes, they then go to the screen and it shows them what they need to transcribe. So you have some fields that they have to put in: the gallons of gasoline purchased, the price per gallon, as well as the total sale price. They have to select the store, the month, day, and year. And then they decide at the end of that first transcription if they would like to transcribe another receipt. So they can decide yes or no, and then they move on. Now, once they're done, we then ask these 3 questions. We ask, what is the color of the hand, or the race of the person in the picture, the gender of the person in the picture, and then is Michael Jordan the president of the US? And so this third question is used to kind of screen out people who are just kind of clicking through your survey and provide no useful information. And the first 2 questions are used to determine the intensity of the treatment. And so the idea is, if I was assigned to a black male treatment, and I respond to this first question that I saw a black person, then it means that I was treated. At least that's the way we're interpreting that response. If I respond that I saw a white person, then we say you were not treated. Or in other words, we say that the treatment wasn't salient. And you'll see how that becomes important in a minute. Then we do the same thing for sex. So what we did then is, we're hiring roughly 2,500 subjects. We then cleaned this data. So we got rid of anyone who said Michael Jordan is the president of the US. We dropped everyone with repeated IP addresses. So one concern with MTurk is that a lot of people outside of the US can use VPN to bypass restrictions that you put on your sample. And so in this case, we restricted the sample to people that had a US IP address. And so when we saw repeated IP addresses, we kind of kicked all of those people out of the experiment. And then we could also measure how long it took people to complete the survey. And so anyone who completed the survey within a minute, for example, would probably just be clicking through. And so we trimmed the bottom 5% and the top 5% of the duration variable. And so that then left us with about 2,100 subjects that we could use for our analysis. So one of the nice things with an experiment is that you rarely ever have to worry about endogeneity, because you kind of randomly assign people to groups. Still, it's important to kind of collect some observational data on the subjects and then check to see whether or not this randomization actually worked. And so that's what I'm showing you here. These are just p-values from a rank sum test on whether or not the mean in these variables differ between the various treatment groups. And so we can compare white groups versus white treatment groups versus the control, white versus black, and so on. And then you can see that there are very few of these p-values that are bigger than 5%. And I've highlighted a couple of them here in bold. Everything that is not highlighted is bigger than 0.1. And so in a sense, you could say, well, the randomization worked, at least based on the observables that we were able to collect in our survey. There might still be unobservables that we obviously cannot control for. The other thing we wanted to check, just to give you a sense of the share of people who responded to that first question in the affirmative, so people who said, yes, I would like to transcribe receipts, and this is shown across treatment groups. So what we did is we basically took black female, black male, and combined them to be in the black treatment, white female, white males to be in the white treatment. Then we took black female, white female, and those then become the female treatment, and black male, white male become the male treatment. So we kind of grouped people by race and gender. And you can see this is just the share of people who transcribed, so race transcribers, sex transcribers. Step away from the mic. So minority just refers to female or blacks. And so this dot is just saying subjects who are assigned to the black treatment, roughly 35% of them decided to transcribe receipts. And then of the subjects that were assigned to a female treatment, roughly 36% of them decided to transcribe receipts. So that's how you interpret these dots. And then we have the 95% confidence intervals around those dots. So you can see across the board, roughly 35% of subjects transcribed receipts. And it doesn't appear to be any treatment effect across these groups. But that's where the salience thing becomes important, because we can then check to see, did people correctly perceive their treatment status? And what you can see in this picture, again, so looking at the black dots, this is just saying the share of subjects who were assigned to a black treatment who correctly perceived their treatment as being black. And this dot over here is share of subjects who were assigned to a female treatment who correctly perceived their treatment status to be female. And you can see that for both of these minority groups, the share of subjects who correctly perceived their treatment status is substantially lower than the share of subjects in the majority group who correctly perceived their treatment status. And that says something about the perception of these subjects, or at least the intensity of treatment, which might then affect the outcomes that we're interested in. And so you might at least think that initially some evidence of discriminatory behavior is already kind of popping up here. Because it's unimaginable that someone would see, my hand is one of the hands in those pictures I showed you before. And it's kind of hard to think someone would see my hand and think that I'm white. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. So it's, one question is, did people correctly perceive their treatment status? They make a decision as to whether or not they want to transcribe receipts for this person, and then exposed, they're asked about the race of the person that they were just, the picture that they just saw, and so it could be exposed to trying to justify the decision that was made, right? And so that's why it was kind of crucial that we had this variable. Okay, so then let's look at the results and see whether or not this mattered. So we're going to run a very simple model, and I think the thought that we had this morning is kind of perfect for this setup. So we have just the binary outcome over here, whether or not you decided to transcribe for the hand that you saw, and then we have your treatment status, we have those covariates that I showed you at the beginning, and then we're going to estimate this model on the full sample, as well as for two separate samples, those subjects for whom the treatment was salient, and those subjects for whom this treatment was not salient. And you would think if non-salience is just random, so people just don't remember the hand that they saw, then there should be no treatment effect when we look at this non-salient group. So we run this model, and then we're going to plot these betas, and the beta is defined such that if it's less than 0, it means that there's discrimination against the minority group. So it could mean discrimination against the black group or discrimination against females. And so this is what we found. Over here, we just have the full sample, which is consistent with the first chart that I showed you, because across the board, we're seeing about 35% of subjects agreeing to transcribe. So you'd expect no treatment effect, and that's kind of what we see in the full sample. But then we restrict this to subjects where we have weak salience. So weak salience just means I correctly perceived the treatment that I was assigned to. So if we're looking at race, for example, it means that I correctly perceived race to be black or race to be white. And there we see a large treatment effect in favor of the minority. So those who correctly perceived race are about 10 percentage points more likely to transcribe for the black employers. And those who correctly perceived gender are, again, about 11 or 12 percentage points more likely to transcribe for females. We also define what we call strong salience. Just means that you correctly identified both the race and gender of the person to whom you were assigned. And again, you're seeing a treatment effect. For gender, it's significant at the 5% level, but for race, it's marginally significant. So it's like 0.1, the p-value. And so in this picture, it crosses the red line. But then when we look at the non-salient group, we're still seeing big treatment effects that are different than 0, at least for females, but in the negative. And this is where it's kind of puzzling, because we're thinking if non-salience was just due to, hey, I don't remember the treatment I was assigned to, so I just guess, then this should just be a wash. And that's not what we're seeing. So we're kind of thinking that maybe this is kind of some ex post trying to rationalize my decision that I made earlier. When we look at the intensive margin, it's kind of nothing going on really. So for the non-salient group, it's a wash, and this is what we were expecting on the extensive margin. For gender, it seems like there's something, but not a whole lot. So most of the effect that we're finding is on the extensive margin. We can also look at accuracy, so whether or not you transcribe the information accurately. You see a little bit of variation across these treatment groups. If we estimate the model, what you find is people are more accurate for females and less accurate for black subjects, and that is for weak and strong salience, and that is kind of a wash then among the non-salient group. problem is these confidence intervals are large, right? So there's not a whole lot you can say for accuracy. And so just to wrap up, what we're finding is there seems to be evidence that the exit decision of these workers is somehow influenced by the race and gender of the employer. The results appear to be consistent on the salience of the treatment. And so we get favorable treatment for minority if these treatment is salient, and we get unfavorable results for minorities among non-salient groups. And so this follow-up survey that I don't have time to talk about, we can find some suggestive evidence that this might be taste-based. So it's not just statistical discrimination, but rather I would prefer to work for one group or prefer not to work for minorities. So I will stop there and welcome questions once we are done with the panel.
Okay, thank you very much. And keep that in mind. So next speaker is Nicardo, who will what? What's your help?
So for several decades, economists and epidemiologists have been studying the effect of income on health, and they have demonstrated that there is a positive association between income and health. Americans, for example, among individuals with income that is less than $35,000, they are 6 times more likely to report being in poor or fair health relative to individuals who earn above $100,000. And disease rates are far more common among the poor than among wealthier individuals. And what's also interesting is that this stark association is evident at every point in the income distribution. Still, very little is known about the causal effect of income on health. So throughout the course of the next 15 minutes or so, I will be talking to you about my work that looks at the effect of family income received at different stages in the life cycle on long-term health. Good morning, my name is Nicardo McInnis, and thank you very much for showing up to my talk today. So to summarize what I'll be talking about, I ask one main question, and that is, what is the effect of per capita family income received at each stage in the life cycle, starting from in utero up to age 31 on health, which is observed at age 32. And in order to answer that question, I separate income into 4 stages. So the first stage is while in utero, the second stage is from birth to age 5, and the other 2 ranges are from 16 to 18 and from 19 to 31. I conduct 2 sets of analyses which aims to address this issue whereby it might be permanent income that matters most as opposed to transitory income. So in the results I will show you for today, I take the average family income in each phase in the life cycle instead of the total income in each of those phases. And I will do that as well in the future, but that has another challenge that I'm working on resolving. And to address concerns that unobserved individual factors that are correlated with health might also be correlated with family income, I implement an instrumental variables approach using 2-stage least squares. And another issue that addresses is that the causal effect might go from health to income. And so what I find, or the main finding thus far, is that OLS estimates tend to understate the effect of income on long-term health. So just to briefly mention a couple of the contributions of this work to the existing literature. First of all, I construct a time-varying instrument that allows me to be able to instrument for family income received at different stages. And by doing that, I'm able to measure one of the more pertinent types of income for health instead of using one-off shocks, for example, like lottery winnings or inheritances. I observe several measures of health and health behaviors, which is also important because in the existing literature, results differ depending on the type of indicator of health that is actually used. And I also contribute to a growing literature that looks at the effect of in utero and early childhood environment on long-term health. And I kind of address one of the broad criticism of that literature, whereby they look at early childhood or in utero environment, but they ignore all the other investment that goes on throughout the course of life up to the time that the health outcome is observed. But here I observe information from birth to the age at which I observe your health outcome, so I can hold constant those income-related family income during all stages leading up to the period that the outcome is considered. And for the final point, which I won't show any results for today, is that I demonstrate the feasibility of conducting life course analysis using survey data that's not collected every year by using multiple imputation. So just to give some background information, well established that there's a positive association between income and health. Insofar as health is a normal good, economic theory would predict that as income increases, the demand for good health would also increase. But you also have other normal goods which may be negatively associated with health, for example, drinking and smoking. So theoretically, it is unclear as to whether or not the causal effect of income on health should be positive or negative. So I will just briefly talk about the literature and what it's found thus far in terms of the effect of income on health. And it's important to note that for the purposes here, I don't say anything about income, the effect of income on longevity, or how income inequality affects health. And I don't interpret cohort analyses as causal evidence because of certain inherent biases from that approach. So one strategy that has been taken but hasn't been used much is to try and find appropriate instruments. And one of the earliest papers to do that was Ettner 1996, that instruments for own and spouse's income using unemployment rate, work experience, etc., for the individual as well as for the spouse. And what they find is that increases in income leads to large improvements in mental and physical health. However, several later studies have questioned the validity of these instruments. More recently, studies have tried using shocks to income to estimate reduced form effects of income on health. And typically, what they find is that there is very little to no effect of these types of income on health, which perhaps is not necessarily surprising, given that health investment decisions perhaps are not driven by these one-off shocks. And here, just to mention a couple other shocks that have been used, pension reform and the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example. But again, the results are consistent in terms of very small to null effects when these approaches are used. So one thing that arises that, it could be that it's permanent income that matters, and these short-term shocks are not capturing permanent income. So to answer this question, I use data from two primary sources, the panel survey of income dynamics and the current population survey. And I will talk about each of those briefly and the role that they play. So the panel survey of income dynamics is one of the longest running panel survey in the world. And so that allows me to observe the life course of several individuals. It first started out with just over 4,800 individuals. And the way it works is that they survey original sample members as well as direct descendants or adopted children. So you have that continual lineage, and so I'm able to assign a large number of individuals to families in every year that the survey was conducted. And it collects information on several topics of interest: health outcomes, demographic information, etc. However, it does not collect information on earned income tax credit benefits. And the instrument that I form is based on the policy variation that is driven by federal and state changes in the earned income tax credit. So what I do to overcome that is that I use the NBR taxing software to estimate the amount of benefits for which a family would be eligible given the information for the head and the spouse of the household. And then I add that to the family income that's reported in the PSID data. And I focus on the health outcomes of heads and spouses only because the PSID data only collects health information on those individuals. And I also limit the sample to individuals who were born between 1950 and 1989, so that there would be sufficient time for them to be at least between the ages of 28 and 32, because of a lot of these conditions which I examine, you wouldn't necessarily see them becoming an issue until around those ages. So just to provide a brief description of what the sample looks like, I have information on 5,000, roughly 6,000 individuals who I observe from the in utero phase up to at least age 28. And not surprising that a lot of these individuals are married, and a large fraction is also white, but the gender is pretty much balanced. I use data from the current population survey to basically form the instrument that I will use to instrument for family income. And I will walk you through how I construct this instrument. But before doing that, I will tell you a little bit about the history of the earned income tax credit so you can understand the variation that I am trying to exploit here. And then I suppose it would also get you to think a little bit about whether you think, this instrument really is valid without even looking at any statistics. So the earned income tax credit was first launched in 1975, and the goal of it was to produce a tax break to low-income working families with children. And how it works is that there are several parameters that guide this program. For example, they have the credit rate, the phase-out rate, the minimum income for maximum credit, the beginning income for phase-out, etc. And so over the years, both at the federal and at the state level, changes have been continuously made to these parameters. So in order to construct my instrument, I exploit the variation coming from all of these sources. And how I construct the simulated instrument using the CPS data is by going through these 4 steps. In the first step, what I do is I take each individual in the CPS data and I use the NBR taxing software to simulate their EITC benefits by assuming that they were living in each of the 51 states. So if I took John, for example, then John would have 51 potential benefits, 51 different benefit levels that he could be getting from the EITC, 1 for each state. In the second step, I formed demographic groups for each state year using gender, race, education, marital status, the number of children, and age. In the third step, I take the average EITC benefits by demographic group for each state year between 1975 and 2017, which yields one observation per demographic group for every state year. And then in the final step, I match each observation or each family from the PSID data to their corresponding demographic group based on the year and the state of residence. So that pretty much summarizes how I form the instrument. And some of you who are familiar with the CPS, maybe it's ringing that, you know, the CPS is not very large. How do you get around, you know, not observing some of the individuals with certain demographic characteristics? And what I do is that I take 5-year running averages, so I am able to overcome that challenge. So what this simulated instrument does is that it abstracts away from those individual level characteristics that would give rise to this endogeneity issue. And another benefit is that it uses a national sample as opposed to using state-level samples, which might introduce other concerns. For example, some region might have different income levels for different reasons. So also abstract from those. And I do not exclude individuals with income that makes them ineligible for EITC benefits. So this is able to cover pretty much all the individuals the way that this instrument is formed. So basically, the variation that's driving this instrument is the changes that have been made to the policy at both the state and the federal level over time. And this was just to remind you of the question, but that's okay, it's a short time. And so the structural equation of interest is Y here, well, let's start with the notation. I index is individual, S index is the state, and T index is the survey year, because I observe individuals turning these ages I observe individuals' health outcome in different years, and the Y is the outcome of interest, such as obesity, metabolic syndrome, smoking, etc. Beta S and beta T represent state and year fixed effects, and these income variables represent the average income received during each stage in the life cycle, and X is the set of demographic information that I use to form the instrument, as well as a set of cohort fixed effects. So if we take beta 1, for example, in the case that the outcome is obesity, beta 1 would measure the average effect of permanent income while in utero on the likelihood of being obese at age 32. So the first stage results here, and I'll quickly go through these. It has the negative sign, as we would expect, that at higher income, you don't get any benefits from EITC. And then what's most important here is these F-stats. The conventional levels is that you should have an F-stat of at least 10. And here, for all of the instrument, I've observed an F-stat well above 10. And just to show you some results for obesity, here each coefficient is estimated from a separate regression. And so what I have here is the effect of in utero income on obesity at age 32, between ages 28 and 32, really. And then in this column, I have the corresponding IV estimate. So in every case, or in practically every case, we see that the OLS estimate is closer to 0 than the IV estimate. And also, we would see that the standard errors for the IV estimates are increasing, which we expect. But the important takeaway from here is that we wouldn't want to use OLS to estimate these effects because they're going to be biased towards 0. And we also pick up the important result that it's showing that overall income received at every stage in the life cycle reduces the likelihood of you being obese between the ages of 28 and 32. And it appears that the income that is received towards the later part of your life is the most important for the effect that income has on obesity. And when I include all of those income variables in the same regression, still observe the same pattern where the OLS result is biased towards 0, and it picks up that the income that seems to matter most, at least statistically, is the income closest to the age at which the outcome is being observed. And so overall, I do not find large effects of in utero and early childhood environment, which contradicts what has been found in recent literature, saying that we observe these huge effects of in utero and early childhood environment on long-term health. So what I plan to do next is to get into the multiple imputation and try to see if the results are the same when I look at total income in each phase, as opposed to just using average income, to see if I can tell a more compelling story, or to see whether or not that holds, because it contradicts a growing literature which suggests that at least in utero and early childhood environment should matter. And that's some robustness check, but that's okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's actually not going to be Peter John Gordon speaking, but Devon Lynch is taking over, of course, co-author.
Are you kidding me?
In my machine?
Is it PDF?
Yes. No, it's not PDF. It's a PowerPoint.
I can probably look at Ask Me later. Open again.
Huh?
Double click again.
Yeah. It's not responding to
There's Ask Me later. I think it's not there.
Okay. Oh. There you go. Thanks.
Done?
Okay. All right, so this is work with 4 authors: Peter John Gordon, one of your own, George Gayle at WashU, and one of his graduate students, Prasanthi, and I'm Devon Lynch. I'm at the University of Massachusetts. So this paper is, the working title is Estimating the Welfare Cost of Moral Hazard in Healthcare for a Large Policy Experiment. And the motivation for this paper is actually, so this is, work is based on Jamaica. And the motivation for this is what happened in 2007. So in 2007, in the midst of a political campaign, the current government then, under Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller, removed the user fee for healthcare in the public facilities for those who are under the age of 18. And I think it could be generally assumed that the reason why she did it is because the Jamaica Labour Party lead at the time, Bruce Golding, had suggested that if the Jamaica Labour Party won the election, that one of the things that they will do is remove user fees for all public facilities. And so the PMP preempted them and removed user fees just for those who are under the age of 18. The JLP actually won the election. I mean, and this was to the surprise of many of the political pundits. and they followed through on the election promise. And on April 1 of 2008, user fee was removed for all public health facilities in Jamaica. And so the question that we're trying to answer, I mean, as economists, is what sort of impact would this have on healthcare demand? I mean, the price is essentially reduced to zero, and you'd expect to see the usage of public facility improving, of course, holding everything else constant. So that is the motivation for why we're doing this. So in the context of what we heard this morning, we're going to try to place this within the realms of a natural experiment. So we make the argument that the policy change was unanticipated and argue that consumer choice variables would have been unaffected by the policy. And this gives us an opportunity to use the difference in difference estimator to estimate the causal inference of the policy. So why do we make the argument that the policy change was unanticipated? I mean, all the polls had shown up to about May of 2007 that the People's National Party was about 10 points ahead of the Jamaica Labour Party, which indicated more than likely that the People's National Party was going to win. And even though in Jamaica we're supposed to be voting for our members of parliament, I mean, indications suggest that we choose the person based on who is at the head of the ticket, more akin to the US presidential election, even though that is not the sort of system that we had. And Porter Shinson Miller approval ratings was in the high 70s compared to Bruce Golding, which was in the 30s. So all indication was that the People's National Party was going to win the election. So nobody would have taken seriously the promise of the Jamaica Labour Party that the user fee was going to fall. So from that perspective, we're making the argument that this change was unanticipated. And that therefore allows us to make the assumption that selection into treatment was not a result of the policy itself. So it gives us a natural experiment, if you will. And so we're analyzing this, as I said, in the context of the difference in difference framework, using the work of Blundell and Costa Davis 2009 paper where they give the different approaches to evaluating microeconomics in terms of experiments. And of course, we heard the presentation this morning from Professor Woolridge. So it's within the same context that we're making this evaluation. So this is our equation of interest. I mean, where YIT is our outcome variable. I've indexed the individual T is for a specific time, and our parameter of interest is alpha I, where that is the effect of the policy on our outcome variables YIT. And DIT is our treatment status. And the treatment status is going to determine what treatment group you belong to. I mean, without the T here. So we're placing you into treatment as 1 if your treatment status is 1 and you're in the time period T1. So T1 here is representing our post-reform period. And of course, you're going to be in the control group if your treatment status is 0 and you're in the post-reform period. And everybody who is in the pre-reform period is assigned to the treatment group 0. And as we heard this morning, we are assuming and heterogeneous that the impact of the policy is likely to have different outcomes on different individuals. So we're not assuming the standard OLS that alpha is homogeneous. It's possible that people are going to have different response to this policy based on their demand for healthcare. And of course, because we're making the assumption that this is the natural experiment, we want to make sure that the randomization holds. And that is why the assumption that the policy didn't have any effect on consumer choice variable is important in this regard. And so the question is, because we're assuming that the parameter alpha I is heterogeneous, the question is, what is it measuring? So what treatment effect are we getting from alpha I? I mean, clearly, policymakers are interested in the average treatment on the entire population. I mean, what they call in literature the average treatment effect. However, I mean, there are a number of assumptions that we have to make in order to get the average treatment effect. Of course, we can also, alpha can also be the average treatment on those who are assigned to the treatment, which is the ATT. And so we use, again, Blundell and Costa-Davis, and making the assumption of the common treatment effect to determine that we're actually estimating the average treatment of the treated. So the unobservables, assignment into treatment is independent of the unobservables. And of course, if we extend the assumption to also indicate that there is no selection based on the expected gains, then we are able to calculate, again, using Blundell and Costa-Davis, that we can actually get the average treatment effect. The problem, however, and we heard that this morning, and it was good to hear, is that we have our YIT, the variables that we have are actually dichotomous, and none of our variables are linear. I mean, so it's either, so the questions that were asked is, did you visit an L facility? So our outcome variable is dichotomous, and if you visited the L facilities, was it private or was it public? And so we had to satisfy ourselves that we were also getting the average treatment on those who were assigned into treatment in this nonlinear framework. And again, using Blundell, an earlier paper, we were able to calculate, of course, assuming that our error term follows an F distribution, that what we're actually calculating is the average treatment on those who were assigned the treatment. So for the analysis, we're going to be using the data of the Jamaica Survey of Living Condition. And this is a nationally represented household survey data that is collected in Jamaica every year from 1988. And we had data from 1989 to 2012. The only year in that period which we don't have any data was 2011. The data ranges from as low as 6,000 in 2001 and as high as 51,000 in the year 2010 and 2003. And we're surveying Jamaicans to determine what's the status in areas like health, education, consumption, and housing. And of course, the data also have individual characteristics, your age. It would have been good to have income, but income is not available, so we are trying to use the information we have to see if we can estimate what individual incomes would be given their individual characteristics. So again, because it's experimental, we're using difference in difference, so we need 2 time periods. Our pre-reform period is 2004 to 2008. Sorry, 2004 and 2006. So in 2005, the data was collected, but the section that we're interested in is the healthcare section, and for some reason, the 2005 and 2003 didn't have the healthcare information, so that's why the gap is there. And our post-reform is 2009, 2010, 2012. And 2011 is missing because no data was collected in the year 2011. And the reason why we're using these years is that even though we have the data from 1989 to 2012, I mean, having cleaned up the data and started our analysis, we weren't comfortable with some of the data that we had before 2004. And so it's our comfort level with the data that I shrink it down to the 5 years that we're using. Our reform year would be the year when the policy was instituted, and so we call the reform period 2007, when the first announcement was made to remove the user fee for those under the age of 18, and when the user fee was totally removed in 2008. And as I said before, we don't have a measure of income, and so what we use to capture income is the annual consumption expenditures. That's we use that as a proxy, and we create quintiles so that we can use the quintile as our treatment and control groups. So those in the quintile 1 are the poorest, and the argument that we're making is that when the policy change took place, those who were the poorest wouldn't have been affected by the policy change. And the reason for this is that they would have been able to visit the public health facilities without paying, given the number of social structures and policies that we have in Jamaica. So the price falling to zero wouldn't affect that because they wouldn't have been paying before. And therefore, those in quintiles 2 through 5 would have been the ones who would have responded to the policy change. So they would be in the treatment group. So how is the reduction of the price of health care at the public facilities to zero impacting these individuals? And so we're going to use the difference in difference estimation to see if we can evaluate some of the impact. Here are some descriptive statistics of our regressors. So I did show you the regression equation, and we leaved out the x variables just for ease of computation. So these are some of our regressors, as I said, explanatory variables. The samples was basically balanced between male and female. And one of the variables of interest, of course, is our insurance status. And about 18%, as you see, 17 to 18% of the Jamaican population actually has insurance. And we're going to be building our model based on people's willingness to get insurance. Because, of course, if you're one of those who have insurance and the price of health care in the public facility is now free, then it may actually make you think about whether or not you want to buy insurance. So are we making selections into treatment depending on whether insurance? Most of the population actually report that their health status is good to very good. And I mean, just looking at the descriptive statistics, one thing that is maybe of interest, again, is the illness length. So we see that post-reform, and this is in days, illness length has actually reduced post-reform relative to pre-reform. And the annual consumption expenditure actually fell in the post-reform period when compared to the pre-reform. So that's the descriptive stats on our regressors. This is probably not the best slide, but these are the descriptive statistics on the outcome variables. And so one of our outcome variables is a count variable. So how many times did you visit an health facility in the last 4 years? And we capped that at 5. And most people visited an health facility at least once. And again, we observed that the number of people visited post-reform actually increased when compared to pre-reform. Other outcome variables: did you visit a facility in the last 4 weeks? Yes, and if yes, was it private, was it public? And interestingly, we're noticing that the number of people who visited an health facility actually decreased, but the number of people who visited a private facility actually increased. And that is consistent with whether or not you visited an hospital or purchased medication. So we're seeing a reduction in the number of people who use the facilities, but an increase in the usage of private facilities. Our preliminary results. And again, we did use the logit, as was suggested this morning, and that's good. But we didn't use the Poisson distribution. So assume this is Poisson and not the negative binomial, please. But suffice to say, I mean, where are we seeing result? And this is interesting. Where we're seeing the result is in visiting the private as opposed to public. So compared to the poorest people who are in quintile 1, so that's the left out variables, we see that the people with more wealth in Jamaica were actually, they reduced their visit to private facility, which is what this is saying, and increased their visit to public facility, right? Which is probably what you'd expect, because if the price has fallen, then you'll expect them to increase their demand. The concern there is, though, I am not sure if this is what the government would have wanted, because it seemed to be suggesting that what is happening is that they might be crowding out the people who are poor, which is certainly not the impact I would imagine that we would want from the policy. And that result is actually robust throughout the paper. So we're comfortable that that result is going to hold, that there seems to be, as I said, a crowding out of the poor. And so we have to look at this carefully. And so where do we go next? We're trying to build a theoretical model that explains what we have found so that we can answer some of the counterfactual. I mean, what if we were to allow the people with insurance to pay at the public facility? What welfare impact will that have? And so that's where we're headed. And I think my time is up, so I will close here.
Okay, so thank you to all three speakers for keeping on time. So we're going to take questions now. What I would suggest is one question per question asker and try to spread it around a bit, and then we can go back and forth. We have roughly, I believe lunch was postponed to 12:30. We have 10 minutes, so a good amount of time, but not much, enough so that somebody can hug it all. So are there any questions? Yes. Okay. Maybe give your name as well, I guess.
All right, so my name is Alaric Campbell.
So it's Alaric Campbell from the Department of Economics.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. This question is for Nicardo. Yes. So I noticed in one of your models, you actually used instrumental variables. So it's really difficult to find good instruments. Can you give us some idea as to whether those instruments met the exclusion restrictions and whether or not you actually tested for that?
Okay, so even without doing the formal test, I actually haven't done the formal test as yet. But even before getting to the formal test, it's really a weak test, and even if it passes it, it may not be, the best instrument. So it's actually more important that you have a good understanding of what your instrument is doing and why you think it makes sense for it to be a reasonable instrument. And I believe that it is a good instrument because what it's doing, it's isolating the portion of income that's actually driven by the changes which were made to a federal and state level program. So it's abstracting away from the individual level attributes which are the source of the endogeneity. So in my estimation, that overcomes the reason for the endogeneity that I start with. And again, even though I haven't done the formal test as yet, which I will do at some point, I think that the premise on which I'm forming my instrument, it seems to be valid.
Yeah, that's acceptable. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so any other questions? Otherwise, yes, please.
Yes. Oh, thank you. My name is Travis Atkinson from Purdue University, also a graduate from UE. The question I have is for Dr. Lynch. I was thinking about the assumption you made about pre and post policy. Because it seems to me that was the assumption on which you're using a difference in difference approach.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if they announced the policy in 2007 and it was activated in 2008, I would think, well, I'm thinking, isn't that still sufficient time for people to think about the policy and whether or not they're going to, whether that policy is going to affect their decision? I'm not quite sure if I understood why you assumed that there wasn't enough time for people to respond to the policy. So could you speak more to why you believe that's a valid assumption?
Okay. All right. So that's a good question. So so let's take one of the things. So if you're using insurance, I mean, and a policy is announced in 2007 and you don't think the JLP is going to win, do you think that would be enough time between September, the election was in September, and on April 8th that you would have made a decision on whether or not to get insurance? I mean, so that's one of the things. I just don't think it would have been. So we're making the assumption that that wouldn't have been enough time for you to have changed your consumer choice variable, since you weren't anticipating that this policy would have been implemented. Even though I see what you're saying, given that 6 months, 4 months period, you're suggesting that that would have been enough, but we don't think that it was enough time that you would have made those major changes so that you would have been selected into the treatment.
And selection into the treatment is whether or not you have insurance?
So, right, well, no.
Okay.
So the treatment is whether or not you have, all right, sorry, let me back up. So we're separating, so our treatment group is those who are poor. So you're in quintile 1, right? So you would have been paying 0 for, right, so that's a control group, right? You would have been paying 0 for health insurance before and after. And then the people in the treatment group are those who would have been in quintiles 2 through 5 because they have more income. I mean, so the point we're making is that that short period of time wouldn't have been enough for you to have responded, to have changed your status, to respond to that policy change.
Okay.
Good.
I think the woman, sorry, I don't know the name in the back first. Oh, you want to?
Yeah.
Okay. You're next. Go ahead.
Okay, good morning. I'm Johnny Francis. I'm from UE, Economic Master's student. My concern is the proxy used for income. You said you used consumption, right? So my thinking is that, like in my head, I think lower income persons tend to consume a lot more than persons who are more wealthy. Simply because I see it in Jamaica so often where you realize that wealthier persons just save more versus what we'd consider poor persons who, you know, consume more, even on a daily basis.
Well, they spend a greater portion of their income, but it's not necessarily the same as consuming more. Okay. But your point, I think that's the point you're making, that they will spend a greater portion of their income, but it doesn't necessarily translate to consuming more. Because if you're looking at the amount of money spent, then the person who has more money is going to spend more money, right? Because it's expenditure. But I understand the point you're making, right?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Linda Bailey, College of Staten Island. Devon, I'm concerned about one thing with the, even though the price fell, I think what people, I don't know if this was unanticipated, but the benefit also fell because it seemed that they didn't put the money back from the budget. So basically you're switching from a private hospital to a public hospital where, yes, you don't have to pay anything, but basically they don't have enough cleaning supplies and the equipment is dirty, right? And we know the effects of that have.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're talking about the quality also, and that's one of the things that we're also, moving forward, trying to estimate into the welfare thing, because you're right, it's not just the price, it's what are you getting for what you're paying for.
Okay. Do you have time for like one more or no?
Does anybody else have a question?
Right.
Yeah, maybe that's fine. I think we have about 2 minutes left.
My question is for Devon Lynch. So regarding the pre-trend test to see whether or not their control group and your treatment group would have been quite similar before the treatment was implemented. So I didn't see anything that showed whether or not your control group was in fact a good control group for your treatment group. So did you guys do any formal test to see if that actually satisfies the requirements for?
No, we didn't, and I don't think we need to in this case, because you're talking about price, and our control group are the people who would have been paying 0 before, right? And paying 0 after. So because what the policy change was that you wouldn't pay for using the public health facilities. Those people who were poor were not paying for using the public health facility before the policy change was made.
But that's not the only requirement for a good control group. So what you want is, so what we're saying is that you cannot observe a person in 2 states.
Right,
So the
agreed.
roads that were treated, you're not able to observe what their outcome would have been if they're not treated. And so what you're looking for is that you're looking for a group of people who you think would give a similar result as to those that were treated. So the poor is, we can find a lot of variables that we know the poor differs from those that are wealthy.
Okay. Can I answer?
Yes.
The control group is the exact same set of people.
Yeah.
Right? Before and after. Nothing has changed with those. The treatment group are the exact same set of people. It's just that before a certain date, they were under one regime, and after another date, they're under a different regime. So all the other characteristics
Are the same.
would be the same.
Right.
So it's the same for the group. So you're saying the control group is the same before and after.
Yes, because
but what
we're
we're
the-
saying is that that's not what makes a good control group.
And treatment, no. Usually what you want is that the only thing that's changing is the variable that that all the other characteristics
policy.
stay
Assuming
the
that prior to the treatment, both groups would have had similar means in their
same. What we're saying here is that it's the same set of people with the same characteristics. So any hidden characteristics doesn't change.
Even the observed factors.
But
were they similar before? And that's what we're saying. You have to start out with 2 groups that are similar.
They're the same. Yes. It's the same set of people.
The treatment people and the control people are the same set of people?
The population is divided up into 5 quintiles.
Right.
The control group is quintile 1. Before the change of policy, those people were exempt from paying at public hospitals, public facilities. So the change in policy doesn't affect them, right? So the difference between what they did after and what they did before is a nice control. The other set of people now who, before the regime changed, they were under one regime, then they are on another regime. So you look on the difference between those before and after, and compare it with the difference of the control group before and after, hence you get the difference in difference.
Right.
But you want the trend between it. So we'll have to discuss afterwards. But you want the trend between your control and your treatment group to be very similar before the treatment, so that after the treatment.
But it was straight in because of repeated cross-section.
Okay, so we'll have to unfortunately finish now. So I think we should give a hand to all the speakers.
One is a richer group. So we know that the characteristics, those two groups are different. Poor people have different treatment than
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. I mean,
it matters because your control
You're comparing her
should
to me.
be a group that looks like your treatment group. So you would have